All right, no trims and tuxes, unfortunately. But yeah, we do have Adam Tuliper. We do have, yes.
That's my tux.
Yours truly, Christopher Harrison. And this is the last module. We're getting a little punchy here,
right.
Implementing Entity Framework with MVC. And, there's been a lot of questions about performance. There's been a lot of questions about concurrency. There's been a lot of questions about EF7. Answer those questions.
I'll try. There's a lot of questions. And after this, I'm going to hang around and answer a couple of questions in the chat room, too. So if you didn't get your question answered yet, stay tuned there. This module is kind of a mishmash of some extra important things to know. So we're going to call this one Integrating Extra Features and Looking Forward. We're going to cover stored procedures. There's definitely been a lot of questions around that.
Performance.
Increasing user experience with concurrency detection, a few best practices, which kind of links to performance.
Yep, that will include.
Now, there's some things we won't cover. For example, when you have databases of 1,000 tables in there and you're mapping to 1,000 entities, there's a lot of things on the net that you can find on articles on breaking apart your entities and performance in those aspects. But we're going to talk about some things as it relates to a web environment.
Beautiful.
Some important things. And looking forward with Entity Framework 7, we're not going to go through Entity Framework 7 demos, unfortunately. The bits are still in quite a bit of flux right now as they're going on to meet the deadline for ASP.NET version 5. But we're going to talk about just some of the new features there and banter about that a little bit because there's some impactful things coming there. So, shall we get rolling?
Yep.
Let's do this. Stored procedures. Why on earth would you want to use stored procedures? There's been a debate that's been going on for many years, and I don't mean to have that debate here because there is and there's not. It's a personal preference thing. Stored procedures, they give you a single point to secure. For a long time, folks thought there was a difference in performance with them, but
there's not.
There's not. Now, there's fringe cases on both sides. There's times when parameterized queries, in some cases, will perform better, and there's other times when a stored procedure will. But in general, they all go towards pretty much that center area where they run about the same. Fringe cases, I said. There are sometimes there's fringe cases. For the most part, it's the same. It's a personal choice. One of the advantages that you get with things like parameterized SQL, which is what Entity Framework generates behind the scenes, is that it allows you to do dynamic querying, dynamic loading, selecting only, say, 2 fields from a database. Stored procedures are kind of more fixed, more rigid. You can still do dynamic querying with them, although I've seen it done many times that have been vulnerable to SQL injection. But let's not have that debate here. Let's, even though we touched upon a couple points, let's just look at how we can do this with Entity Framework.
Forgive me, I'm just going to mention real quick that just because you're using stored procedures does not mean that you're impervious to SQL injection. You can still do SQL injection with stored procedures if you call them incorrectly.
That's right. Shameless self-plug. If you look, search on TechEd for my last name, session dev 333. I did hack-proofing your ASP.NET applications for TechEd a few years back, and I talk about the database side and the dynamic queries and things like that. All right, now let's move on.
Sorry, I'm done.
Stored procedure support came in Entity Framework 6. It is only Fluent API based. In the past, you could do it through the designer, and you could also do it manually. And you can still do it manually. And by manually, I mean you can call database.SQL query, and you can give it an entity, and you can give it a stored procedure to call. It will call that procedure. So in this case here, we'll call that proc get trivia option.
Okay.
It will call that. It will look at the actual fields returned from the database and try to map it to this entity right there. So that was a way you could do it in the past. That was one of the advantages of using something like the repository pattern, because in the repository pattern, you could simply map it to a stored procedure there. It was an easy place to kind of do it. Now, so I did mention a designer. When we talk about Entity Framework 7, we'll touch upon this important point right here, which is going away. So code first that we looked at will actually generate us the code for our various procedures. And if you see there, I mentioned insert, delete, and update. And wait a minute. Why would there not be a select? Why can't we do a stored procedure for select? So let me ask you something. If you, the astute listener, are using Entity Framework and you're using stored procedures strictly for insert, update, delete, and select, what are you using really for the power of the ORM? The select statement is where the ORM gives you a lot of power, where you can dynamically select things, and these built-in where clauses there. So that is the power. That is why you don't see the select supported here. You could do that, again, you can use this kind of legacy format here, but it's really meant for the stored procedure supports for insert, delete, and updates. Again, I want to really clarify the point. You can still use some sort of select procedure, but you're going to be using it in a procedure like we have right here, this guy here. All right, so let's look at how we can integrate stored procedures. Let's build up on something that we've done, or I'll say we'll rebuild something that we've done before. Let's take this guy and we'll call this additional coolness, because we'll build upon this for the rest of this demo here. I'll do change authentication, we'll do no authentication, just so we have something we can install in the framework to. All right, get Entity Framework 7 in there, and I'm sorry, Entity Framework 6 in there, and let's go ahead and add a model, and this is going to be our album.
I swear I've seen this before.
Seen this before. I hope the repetition here, this just shows you how easy this is. All right, fix this up. Now, what we're going to do, we want to take this particular album, and let's write this out to the database, and if you remember, enable migrations. So this is kind of coming full circle. We're going to look at how to piece everything together here. Enable migrations. Let's add that migration, call that initial. And then we'll go ahead and update our database. We've now pushed our album table to the database like we've done before. So our database exists. It's in the same state as our application here. Now, what I've done, though, is if we were to look at our database, let's actually connect and do that. Connect to MS SQL local DB. And actually, I should have specified my database here. This is additional coolness.
That's why you should have called this additional coolness. Oh, no, you did. I'm sorry. See, I'm not even paying attention over here. I'm just sleeping.
All right, so we have albums here. As it stands, anytime that we query albums, it's going to be using parameterized SQL. I talked to you earlier about how we can generate those, log those queries out and see what's happening on the back end. So I want to change this to be able to use stored procedures. And so let's go back over to our context class here. And we're going to override that onModel creating. And with that Fluent API, we're going to say model builder dot entity of type albums map to stored procedures. Let's compile that. That looks good. Easy enough, right?
Seems so far, yep.
So let's go ahead and let's add a new migration. And we'll call this added stored proc. Even though we didn't technically make a stored procedure here, let's see what happens. I just said I want to support stored procedures for album. And here's a migration that was just created. And if we look at this, db album underscore insert, and I'll talk about these names shortly because they have an underscore in them by default.
Oh, no.
And we can see our SQL statement right here. So if we go ahead and say, all right, if I want to bring my database up to date with these stored procedures, what does this look like? And here's our create procedure, all of our SQL to create those stored procedures. If we run this right now, so let's go ahead and update my database. Build it. And let's scaffold this out. So we're going to be able to make it so we can edit an album and edit an album. So we're going to new scaffolded item, MVC5 controller. I love that this process is so simple, just takes literally seconds. All right, so what we're going to do now, we're going to run this, make sure this works. I don't care about my SQL there. Don't ask me to save it. Close that. All right, let's F5, chugga, chugga, chugga.
There you go.
You do it. You do better.
Chugga, chugga, chugga. All right. Chugga, chugga, chugga.
right, so I'm going to go to /albums here. And let's create a new one. Call this My Awesome Music Story. And this is going to be $999.48. OK, coming back over here to IntelliTrace. Actually, I should set a breakpoint for this. Let me run this again. And let's go to set a breakpoint right here. All right. So we set a breakpoint when we are reading those albums here. And let's look at what's going on. Right now, we've got our select statement here. So select album, that's as expected here. We've got our select statement because we can't override that right now. So next, let's go ahead to our edit and set a breakpoint on our edit right here after we save our changes. We're going to edit. We'll make that $999.99.
$1,000 for an album. That's
not $1,000. It's $999.99. It's cheaper to the consumer that way. All right, we see what happens here, and there we go. Execute non-query album underscore update. So there's a stored procedure getting called. I literally didn't have to do anything but tell it I want to support stored procedures, and we did that in our context class. Let's go ahead and stop this, and I'll show you that again. Right here. This is the magic, just this one line. If you want to customize this a little bit, it's actually pretty easy. We can do a couple things like this. So we can call map to stored procedure, but then we can really get into customizing this here. Let me scroll this over so you can see this. So you can say the insert has that particular name, proc underscore insert album. Let's remove that. O.delete. Notice I'm using a different letter here. And we're going to call this proc delete album. And so that's how we can kind of customize these names out here. Now, the important thing to point out, we're going to do this one next too. And let's take, we need the last one as well. So we're going to do O.update. And I actually need, let's do my update one here as well. We'll call that U.
Me?
Yeah. U.hasName, proc update album. So this is how you have a little bit of control over kind of changing the names on these. Let's do one more syntax here.
I think you're missing a couple of closing parens.
I think I am. Let's go ahead and check out.
Yeah, basically on the insert update delete, you've got the open, then you say has name. Yeah, you need a close, and then one more.
Still getting an issue here. Hold on 1 second. I actually think I have a snippet of this that I can just copy from.
There you go. Please hold while we rearrange our code.
Rearrange code. All but briefly here. Briefly. There we have it. Oopsie. Semicolon. So insert, actually we'll call this update, and proc underscore update album. All right. Back this up. That's the problem with these. Somebody asked earlier if I can change the size of this font text actually to be smaller. Normally you get the other way around. All right. So this is the way we override them. Insert, we do update and delete. That actually just reformatted for me, so I'm not going to mess with the formatting here the whole time. This is how you override the actual name of the stored procedure. For your insert, update, and delete. If you leave out any one of them, it will revert back to whatever its default method is for naming that. Let's take this one step further. And the last thing I want to show you with stored procs here is you can change what you get back. So for example, if you want a stored procedure to, in this case, insert, but then you want it to return something for you. Let's go ahead and format this down a little bit. So again, so you can see this a little bit better here. So we're specifying our insert proc name, and then we're saying from that particular result, I want you to return the album ID. So we get a little bit more control over that here. So it's often that when we add a new record, you might want that ID back for whatever's using it. So this is a way that you have a little bit more control over that particular procedure there. Let's go ahead and see how NLE Framework detects this. Add migration, updated procs. Before I do that, let me build. All good. OK, update database, script that guy out. And here we have it. There's our new proc add album. We do our insert. And then here's where we select our last one, and we return it back.
Perfect.
Insert migration history. So we have a little bit of control over how we can kind of customize this process here. Next, this is my favorite one. This is actually going to be my favorite demo of the day. So increasing user experience with concurrency detection. This one is way cool. Are you excited?
I'm excited.
OK. So something I actually learned. You missed what I just did on the slide there. I had Chris, and I just wrote Christopher.
Thank you.
Christopher, not Chris. As Christopher showed, it is really easy to implement via concurrency token. So using the timestamp here and adding it, you can automatically tell NLE Framework that that's supported as a row version on the server side. So what we're going to do now is you can also specify that with your Fluent API. You don't need a timestamp attribute. Now, we can do something really cool here. With MVC, you have different types of filters you can install. Action filters, exception filter. And so we're going to install a filter, and that's going to look for a particular exception.
OK.
And what we're going to do then is user's going to update it. If there's a concurrency exception, we're going to cache that exception. We're going to look at the values that the user's saving. We're going to get the values from the database. We're going to compare, and we're going to let the user decide what's different.
Perfect.
All right?
OK.
Now, so this.
Oh, I was just going to say, for those of you not familiar with an action filter, what an action filter will do in MVC is it gives you the ability to take a normal action like, index or delete, and based on something that happens, based on something that's being passed in, based on how it's being called, it can then modify the behavior, potentially redirect you to somewhere else, etc. So, for example, when you're trying to do security, you'll do that by utilizing action filters. And so he's going to go in and show off how you can do this. When it throws the exception, it will then do something really, really cool. And I don't want to steal any of the mojo from your demo, so I'm going to let you take it over from there.
All right. I'm going to update that last migration here because I'm not going to return anything from my stored procedure. I don't really care about that. That was just to show you how we can customize this process a little bit more. And so let's make sure my database is up to date. OK, so let's go ahead and update database just to make sure we're in a fresh state to work with here. Perfect. All right, so what I need to do is take this action filter, and we're going to copy that out. And this code will be posted up to GitHub. And I'm going to add in here we're going to add this filter in. We'll give it a really long name. Handle concurrency exception filter. And paste in this code. And before we go walking through what all this kind of stuff does, let's use it, and then we can see what's going on here. The important thing is, with this filter, if you want to use this, you register it when your application starts up and registers everything else. You'll notice in your app_start folder, which in MVC is not a special folder, it's just a convention people use that any kind of startup code you throw in there. And right now, the way MVC error handling works is there's a handle error attribute added there. So we're going to add on a new filter there, the one that we just added. So we're going to say filters.add new handle concurrency exception filter.
And that's now added globally. You don't have to go into each individual action that you would want it on added in.
Don't have to do it on each individual one, so that's good. So this is global. If you don't want it globally and you only want it applying to a couple different areas, a couple different controllers, you can add this as you see fit. I'm just going to do this globally on here.
And by the way, that's also where you add an SSL. I always get asked that with MVC. How do we enable SSL? Require SSL. Just add that right into there. So, yep.
All right, so let's go ahead and go on over to our album class here. So let me close that out. Now in our album class, what we need is we'll add our timestamp to this class. So we'll call this a bytes array, if you all remember. I'll call this timestamp or row version or whatever you want. The name doesn't matter. What does matter is this guy right here, timestamp. We'll have to add the reference for this. Compile. Looks good so far. The other thing we need to do, 2 steps here. We have to add it to our MVC view, and we also need to add it to our controller to tell it that we're going to bind as we come back. So let's just go back to our edit view, because we want, for edit, this is when we're going to use this.
Update the database at some point.
And we're going to say html.hidden4 There we go. So we get that byte data that's serialized out to that hidden field on our view here. So that's going to make a round trip. And if we go to our controller, our albums controller, our edit method, where we get posted back here, we need to tell it to include timestamp, or it won't come back and it won't bind it. All right, I think that about does it. Let's update our database, compile, and go ahead and let's see what kind of changes we've got here. It should just be our pending changes, and automatic migration is disabled. So what do we have pending here?
Oh, you've added in the timestamp, so you just need to...
Oh, add in migration.
Add migration.
Add migration.
Update.
Added timestamp. I just did it. You'd think I remember. It's getting to be the end of the day now. Now we should see that timestamp show up for a migration. And we're no longer returning the value from this procedure. So this is all good. Let's update our database. All right, let's run this and just make sure that we have a working app. Chugga, chugga.
Chugga, chugga, chugga.
Chugga. Oops, my student. That's the next demo student. It is getting to the end of the day. All right, so albums is what we need here, not album.
There we go. Looking good.
All right, there's my awesome music story. So I'm going to...
it right there. It's awesome.
I'm going to open this in a new tab. I'm going to edit this one here, and let's go ahead and view the source. There's my timestamp field right there. B9E, which would match on the other one as well. Both the same timestamp. So I'm going to go ahead and change this, just make it a little bit cheaper to sell better on Amazon. Save that.
A 0.1% discount.
Come over here. This timestamp no longer matches with the database timestamp, as you showed. We're going to save this. Boom, we get our DB update concurrency exception gets thrown here. So far, so good. It means our timestamp was binding. We came back, we tried to save the database. Christopher talked about the whole process where it basically tries to update, sends in the timestamp with it. If it doesn't find that one, throws an exception.
Yep.
And so that's what's happening here. The filter has not been used yet. Yet. Let's go ahead and come into this filter, and let's set a breakpoint right about here. And F5 that guy.
And so it now went to that filter. So what happened is that exception was thrown. It was trying to find something to handle the exception. Nothing caught it. And so typically at that point, it would then reroute you to your generic error page. But because of the fact that Adam had gone in and registered that filter, when MVC saw that particular exception, that DB update concurrency exception, it then rerouted it to that filter, and now it's inside that filter.
That's right. We hit this code right here, and it went boom.
Boom, as opposed to chugga, chugga, chugga.
I'm waiting for the screen.
I'm not Barry. I don't have those at the ready.
Oh. We were told they're not at the ready.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so anyway, so no worries. So this blows up here, so we never even get to this code here.
Just imagine a
exception.
There,
oh, there we go.
Nice.
Bubbles up, gets caught by this filter. So we are brought into the filter right now. In the filter, we're getting an instance of our concurrency exception right here. And now what we can actually do is, because this is an entity framework specific exception, this gives us some interesting thing that we can do. We can find the actual entry here, and we can see this DB entity entry, and we can get its current values. So there's our album, our 999.99.
Mm-hmm.
We can reload this, and we can get these values here, our database values, which we can see are 999.89.
So you've gone back out to the database and grabbed the other one. So we have the current one, and now you've gone out and grabbed the other one from the
Grab the other ones.
Yep.
And let's go ahead here. We're adding an error to the model state. So we're adding something that the user will see. And it's got this long message, which you'll see on the screen in a second. Then we can go down here. I have some code here because whether you're using an entity or a view model, they're kind of a little bit different procedure. So I have a little code here to detect that. And then we need to update the timestamp field, because if we're going to allow the user to resave, we need to give them the current timestamp from the database so they can overwrite the database. Otherwise, you're going to be caught in this loop of not being able to update the database.
Right.
So this is where we're giving them the new timestamp again. And then we're taking all those properties that we're detecting are different, and we're going to be writing them out as errors to the page here.
Okay.
Then we are, instead of going to like the error page, we're just going to return a view result, which is going to go essentially return the same view that we were just in and display some data out here. So check this out. Let's F5 this, cross our fingers. There we go. The record you attempted to edit was modified by another user. After you got the original value, the edit operation was canceled. The current values in the database have been displayed. Now, since we have that current new token, we get this message here. If you still want to edit this record, go ahead and click Save, and this will, we've got the current token in the page, it's hidden, and it'll update it with the current one. And we can see that somebody else has updated this here to 999.89. So literally, by just adding the action filter to your project and nothing else, this happens all automatically. So if you have 10 fields on a page, you'll see 10 fields on how they're different. So I'm going to go ahead and save this to overwrite that. There we go. Easy enough.
Just like that.
Very cool.
And you're going to be putting all that code into the GitHub repository.
All that code will be on GitHub.
Okay.
One caveat to mention here, that sometimes you'll find an issue that if you happen to save that record and then load a bunch more data after that, you'll never get to that point. So if you want this detection on your web page, you kind of have to you have to test it. You have to find out where you're going to blow up at. And if you happen to need any data for later on, you're going to have to load that and add it to view data or whatever you're using. I'll talk about that when I post it up to GitHub. But that code is very useful. I've used it in web apps before in production. It's awesome. When users see that, they're like, oh, this is great. I know what changes, who overwrote it. You get a lot of control here. OK, let's talk about a few best practices in dealing with Entity Framework in MVC.
Let's do it.
Some general best practices here. So in a web world,
in a world,
name of the web. First thing, our web layers. So we've got our controller. We pass off to a view. Consider these layers essentially disconnected from each other. You can pass a little bit of data. The mechanism is a little bit limited to pass data between them. But if you have a context class in your controller, if you have a context class in there, you're not passing that context to your view to do something later. You need to do everything in your controller or something the controller calls and pass that data already processed, not lazy loading later on. One of the things that beginners have a problem with is when they start using Entity Framework and MVC. They might load up some data or think they load up data inside of their controller, and they pass off that entity to their web page and they try to access other related entities, maybe album details. And that causes them a problem because it tries to use that connection that's already been disposed back in the controller. So you always want to load up your data first. And the way that you can do that is through this method right here. Always call .toList when you get your data back. So we've looked at this code quite a bit today, context.albums, you always want to call toList to make sure it executes that on the spot, because the way that this works, if you don't call this, it waits until you actually use this returned object to execute it against a database. It's a deferred execution. So you need to call toList. Another thing, and this is related, web environments. You really, really should. If you don't, an angel will lose its wings. That's a very sad procedure.
Wow.
Disable lazy loading in a web environment. Lazy loading is enabled by default. And so this guy right here, it's simple. Context.configuration.lazyLoading enabled equals false. Well, the problem then you might think is, well, what happens if I need to include other data there? I need my album details. You know,
Right.
I need this data. That's no problem. So before you could just reference album.album details, this is the way that you tell Entity Framework to eager load that data. This says, as soon as you make this call right here, I want you to go ahead and load albums and including my album details. And you can chain these calls together. If you want another include, you can just add it here, .include, and add another table there, .include. If you're using this in a lot of other applications, there's some guidance from the Entity Framework team that if you get past about 3 include statements, then you might want to look at using lazy loading in other scenarios. Lazy loading, again, in a web environment can be pretty dangerous. Also, and there's some questions that were surrounding this in the chat room, the DB context class, it's not thread safe. Don't cache it. Don't try to optimize the performance of it. It's a pretty basic rule. Per your request, instantiate it, use it, and get rid of it. Don't worry about what it's doing behind the scenes. That's all you need to know is use it and dispose of it when you're done. If you try to cache it or put it in a session variable or put it in a static variable where different things could be hinted at the same time, things are going to go wrong. It's not meant for that. Use one, instantiate it, dispose of it when you're done, and you'll be happy. Things will work well.
An angel will get its wings back.
An angel will get its wings back.
All right.
When that context is gone, so when you have a using statement, like we have here, when you get down here outside of that context, anything that you're doing with any data you've returned from it, that connection behind the scenes is gone. It's already back to the pool. It could be disconnected. It could be closed. So always execute that result set here. And I'll show you another way that we can do this when we're doing async, which we're going to talk about next very shortly here.
So by calling that toList, it's going to execute right then and there. If you don't, and you just return back the IEnumerable, you've gotten rid of the DB context. It's going to try and use the data, and it's going to fail because it's going to go, wait a minute, you didn't actually load it. It's trying to go back to the database, and it can't.
Always, 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 I would say without fail, when you're going to return anything from a collection of information, which albums is a collection of information, always use toList at the point in time when you're querying it. Always.
Just get yourself in that habit.
Yeah. Watch out for complex joins, and this is an area where I could see somebody say, you know, we have a bazillion tables we're joining together with some pretty more advanced criteria. We're using cross-apply SQL statements and a whole bunch of other things. In those cases, you might want to say, rather than having 30 joins inside of your Entity Framework code, we're just going to use a stored procedure. We can manage that separately. That's fine. When you run outside of those scenarios, it's always good to see what's going on behind the scenes. And so we talked about this in Module 1, but again, here's the code for it to log out your database statements. It's very important to see what Entity Framework is doing, just to make sure that you didn't miss anything in your particular code, or you're not doing anything in a weird way to generate these really, really huge queries. Some scenarios with Entity Framework, when you're doing a lot of inserts, performance can slow down because auto-detect changes enabled is true. So behind the scenes, when you add objects to Entity Framework, it detects changes. When you save, it detects changes again. There's this object graph that tracks behind the scenes. So if you're doing a lot of inserts, you can turn that off. And the good news is you can turn it off, execute what you need to execute, and just turn it right back on again. So context.configuration.auto-detect changes enabled, false. Insert your 1,000 objects, save your changes, and then just turn it back on again. Real easy. Just a little thing to keep an eye out for. Let's talk about async, and I'll show you a demo of async here. Entity Framework finally supports asynchronous queries.
Yay!
Yay! Async is built into most of our technologies now, and when it came to ASP.NET, there was so much cheer. why use async? So when you're in a web, let's talk about the web environment right now. When you're in a web environment and you're using IIS, there's a limited number of threads that are available to process your ASP.NET code. And when you basically use up all those threads, connections get blocked coming in. And they're not unlimited. You can't spin up a billion of them. There's limited resources there. So if you have a call to a database, even though it might seem maybe it's a half-second call, when you're on trying to scale out your web server, a half second could serve many, many, many other web requests. So async will basically tell the system, hey, we're going to go do this task, return that important thread back to the thread pool so IIS can use it and we can handle other user requests. And when that code comes back and it's ready, we're going to bring that other thread pool thread back and execute on there. So it can save performance quite a bit. It can also be overused quite a bit. One of the things you can do is when you generate your let's stop this app here. When you scaffold out your code.
I'm so glad you're showing this. I was actually thinking about exactly that.
So we already did albums. I'll just show it again here just because I want to show you this guy right here. Async controller actions. And so let's delete my albums controller.
Oh!
Actually, we'll call this
Call it old.
Old. And no. I can probably just do this too. We're going to rescaffold this anyway. It's an easy process. So we're going to rescaffold right now. Let's compile and add new scaffolded item. And let's go ahead here. We're going to do album, check off, use async controller actions. And let's see what the difference in the code here is. It's prompting me for the save here because of this query I have open. All right, now if we scroll down here, this is still the same. But notice, we have async, and instead of returning action result, so that's what it was like before, now it's async task action result. This is a common pattern that you'll see. All of them look like this, async task. And the query that you're going to use here, so before we were doing db.albums.find, now notice there's a find async. What you also get is for a list of information, instead of a to list, you have a to list async. And a to dictionary async. You'll find that a lot of these methods here, let's look just a couple here.
Any one of these that would actually give you back data right then and there has an async.
There we go. And so that's it. To enable async in the application, you can either manually do it like this and have it scaffolded out, or if you want to convert any of your existing methods on over, no problem. You just add this around it. You'll get prompted to add in the namespace for it. And then that's it. You just want to call the async version. Yep. Super, super simple.
It's worth just kind of mentioning there. So that task object that's being returned is a promise. It's a wrapper. And the actual payload is going to be inside of it. And so that's why you've got that task and then the generic of action result. What's really cool is that the compiler or the runtime sort of already knows that in advance. So if you go back and you take a look at the code again, that it's just simply return view, that he didn't have to actually construct a task object. He just simply said return view. So that part of the code doesn't change. It's just simply now that we're calling await and then the async method, that's where it's going to be changing.
Yep. Runtime comes in here. As soon as we hit this method right here, this actual thread that was processing that goes back. This gets handled and essentially passed off separately. Yep. When it's all done, it comes back, continues processing, and voila, all done. It works beautifully. Now, let's talk about connection resiliency.
Let's.
Connection resiliency is a really neat feature that was added to Entity Framework. I've had countless errors because there was a blip on the network that have happened. Causes the connection to go dead, user sees a web page. So with connection resiliency, it essentially specifies a retry policy. So you can say, hey, I've got a database that's way over there, or maybe a shabby network that we're going across.
Way over there.
Way over there.
Okay. Way over there. It's by the door and the vacuum.
Thousands of miles away. Geez, I've seen some really slow networks before. I've seen queries time out. And so what you can have here is 4 modes default execution strategy, SQL execution strategy, DB execution strategy, and the one that we're going to look at today is a SQL Azure execution strategy. So these are defaults. Some of them you can override. You can say, I want you to retry this connection 5 times with a 10-second delay, for example. So you have control over how this retry is going to happen. When the timeout finally occurs, and it's tried the retry for 4 times or however much you specify, it throws a retry limit exceeded exception. So you can catch that exception and tell the users to either retry, refresh their data again. You can handle that in a graceful way, but that is the exception that happens to get raised for that. So let's look at, I'm going to take this to a separate example here, and I'll tell you why.
Why?
Ask me why, I shall tell thee. There is an example on MSDN that I grabbed on here. It's Contoso University.
Welcome to Contoso University.
And the thing that makes this...
does a lot of things.
A lot of things. It's a big university. Big university. And what we're trying to do with this guy here, let's look for Azure, because this uses the Azure execution strategy. And the way that you do that, set execution strategy. So you create this configuration class that inherits from DB configuration. Mm-hmm. In the constructor, you set the execution strategy, system.data.sql client, and you give it what your execution strategy is. And if I look at the constructor here, we can see max retry count and the maximum delay. So you have a bit of control over this here.
Pretty straightforward.
Super easy to set up. That's all you need to do there. The reason I'm using this demo is because I'm working on my local system. How do you fake a connection issue from me going to local DB? I've tried. While this was executing, I'm shutting down my local DB instances. You can do from your SQL local DB command line command. But what happens is it's extremely resilient at SQL local DB. And as soon as you shut it down, it sees it shut down and it spins it right back up again. So it's very difficult to do. So this demo actually has an interceptor built in here. And this code, essentially, it's looking at what you're querying. And if it sees that you've used the word throw in your query, then it actually fakes the same kind of connection error that it would see. So it's pretty cool to watch. So let's go ahead and F5 and chugga, chugga, chugga.
Chugga, chugga, chugga.
Chugga. You got to do that. Chugga, chugga.
Yeah. The arm motion helps. Yeah.
Chugga, chugga, chugga.
Yep.
So we're going to go into students here. Chugga, chugga. I'm taking that away and a resume generating event. RGE.
Yep.
Now this is going to get called for everything here. So all the Entity Framework commands, that interceptor is going to get called. So let me come back here and set my breakpoint again. So I can search for a student. Let's go ahead and let's just get right to it. I'll search for Adam. And that returns right away with no result, as expected, because we don't have any data. Now let's go ahead and just give it what it's looking for with throw. And we search. All right. Our parameter should have thrown it. It does. Perfect. Now we're going to look down at our output here. So far, we've opened the connection. Let's F5 that. OK. IS express information returning transient error for command select. In other words, it just faked the error here. We've got the error again here. Mm-hmm. Failed in 25 milliseconds. It's going to happen again.
With error, dummy.
With error. It's a dummy error. Failed again. So the retry policy is happening right now. Happened 4 times. And we've now hit our retry limit exceeded exception. Super easy to implement. A little bit more difficult to fake. If you had your local machine and you're going against your work SQL server, easy enough because you can pull the plug on your local machine and see what happens with that. A little bit more difficult in the local machine. But we've got it faked successfully here. So that's pretty cool. That's actually one of my more favorite newer features. All right, looking forward with Entity Framework 7, and then I think you'll take it away. You'll close it up with an Azure.
Azure deploying out to Azure. Yep.
This will be quick. So Entity Framework 7, the bits are in flux right now. The team, again, is working feverishly to hit the ASP.NET 5 release to make sure all the features are there, since that's a major platform that uses Entity Framework. So one of the things that was announced is that the designer has been removed going forward. That's why I didn't cover it today, because it's going, as I said earlier, the way of the dodo bird. We're going to have the code first only approach. And one of the reasons here is having the designer, it was tracking EDMX files in the back end, so it's got this XML format. And then you've got code, and that's trying to sync with the database. There's too many points of kind of these connection points. If you ever had to go in and manually edit that XML, it was a real pain. So I'm glad we're just dealing with code anymore. And again, if you have an existing database, you just reverse engineer that into a code-first model. EF7 has literally been rewritten from the ground up with performance in mind. The performance on EF7 is awesome. And we get some new platform support. So it's going to support Linux, OS X. I have asterisks here over Windows Phone and Windows Store. There were some initially supported platforms. That's temporarily on hold while ASP.NET 5, all the bits for that get pushed out. So, but I expect to see that soon, along with some other additional Azure support on there. New data stores. And my, I think, favorite one out of all this is an in-memory database. So one of the reasons that you see that folks would go and use something like the repository pattern was when you were writing your unit test and using Entity Framework, you're essentially going against some real database somewhere. You're making these data calls. And that, if you faked your database calls, you were dealing with a collection of information that you're passing back to your code methods. That may or may not act differently than Entity Framework acted.
Right.
So, and there were some other database engines that supported in-memory databases, so you could send a query and expect a proper result back, whether it was in-memory or the file system. So this is really exciting that Entity Framework 7 is bringing this now, because I think from a unit testing standpoint alone, or a quick testing standpoint, you don't need a database install. You can just write it to memory. For a unit test, you're not writing out anywhere. It can clean up easy. I think it's a beautiful thing.
Right.
We also looked a lot at the update database command today. Both of us ran it probably about an average of 27.4 times each.
27.4.
27.4.
Definitely. 27.4.
In EF7, those commands are now split to, I think, to note the actual task at hand a little bit better. You could update -database. You could update -database-script. Two different things. So now we have apply -migration, and right here, and then we have a script your migration. So makes it a little bit, there's times I've meant to type -script and I forgot, and I just updated my database. So I like the fact that these are pulled out now into two separate commands.
And it also sort of gives you a bit of consistency there, because you say add migration, and then you say update database. And I really like just having things that are consistent. So
Yes.
I add the migration, now apply the migration, or script the migration.
Yep.
Yeah.
And we still stick to the verb noun.
Yep, exactly.
All right.
Cool.
So would you like to
Sure.
show the goodness?
Let's go ahead and do it. Let's close it all out. Let's put this up to Azure. So a couple of people have asked, how about doing the deployment? How do we manage all of that? Fortunately, Visual Studio makes this really simple. Right-click, publish, Microsoft Azure websites, sign in, and
I love the Azure integration now in the Visual Studio.
oh,
It's amazing.
absolutely. Are you going to ask me to grab my phone? Let me just grab it, just to be on the safe side. And then my super duper top secret password.
4-9 rhubarb foxtrot.
There we go.
It's not the shortest password I've ever seen.
Ah,
16 characters.
there we go.
Very good.
Okay.
I like the security.
Thank you. And then my two-factor authentication. It's really funny. When you're doing demos, you typically want to say what you're typing in. And so it's always hard to tell your brain not to say when you're typing out your password. I was actually teaching a class one time, and I was using Social Security number as an example for... excuse me, give this a second. I was using Social Security number as an example for a regular expression, and without thinking about it, you're just in automatic mode. I started typing out my social, and I got about 4 digits into it until I realized, oh, wait a minute.
Oh, goodness.
That's a problem, and managed to stop. Fortunately, it was just a classroom, with 7 people that were in there,
Yeah.
but still, yeah.
Interesting.
Anyway, okay, so I can actually just write in line here, go in and say, all right, well, I want a brand new database, and this will be our EF MVA that's available, and I'm going to put this onto my MSDN Premium. We are in West US today. I want to create a brand new database with EF MVA as our user, and my password. There we go. There we go, and I'm going to hit create, and let this go ahead and create this for me. Give this a minute. You know, people actually complain about how long this takes to go in and create all of that on Azure. And all I keep saying is, think about what this is doing and think about what you would have to do on your own to make this happen. You're standing up an IIS server, setting up your database, configuring,
Make sure your database is installed, up and running. Yeah.
This is actually kind of funny. I'm now getting an error message here. I'd exceed my quota. All right, give me 1 second here. I'm just going to head on over to manage windowsazure.com. Thank you. There we go. And give me 2 seconds.
Think about it. Take like an album class. We worked with it all day today.
That's why.
You can literally write a website that allows you to update. Well, let's take a business scenario. You're at your business. You have a customer and order detail information. You create your entities inside of minutes. You test it out locally. You publish it to Azure. Literally, in under 10 minutes, you have a CRUD website, not cruddy, a CRUD, create, read, update, delete, website published up to Azure that you can then go to your organization or it's your public website. It's amazing. It's so fast.
And you know what I decided to do is I'm just going to use my pay-as-I-go, and that way that'll solve the problem. Okay, so pay-as-I-go, because I can have basically as many servers as I want, and now let's go in and hit create, and now we'll let it do its thing. So chugga. Oh yeah, you can show now. So he was concerned if I was typing in something sensitive, passwords or otherwise. So. No, he's more than happy to show demos that will fail. More than happy to put that up there. So, thank you, Danny. All right, there we go. And so now what this did is this automatically grabbed our published information, so it allows me to go ahead and connect. All I have to do now is just simply hit next, and now you're going to notice right here that it's automatically got my 2 databases, that it's got the one for my an identity, and then it's also got the one right here for that data context, and so it's going to the exact same data server. There's going to be a quiz on that name later. Hey, Adam, what do you think checking that box might do?
Oh, that's an interesting one. That is going to execute code first migrations. That's going to enable it. So any changes that you push out to the server are automatically going to be applied.
Okay. That can be both a good thing and a bad thing.
Yes. Interesting enough, I had actually, I was hanging out with Julie Lerman, who's done a ton of Entity Framework stuff one time, and I asked her, I was like, you know, just as a side note, I think I have this website that keeps updating itself, and I don't remember enabling it in Visual Studio. And she actually did an MSDN article on that after that, referring to some secret friend that I think gave the idea for it. I was that person.
So you've now blown the secret. You're the secret friend.
And talked about what that value's for. And that's it. It's a little checkbox there, but it's extremely important to understand what that's going to happen. That continually, as you keep publishing, you're going to be pushing those changes out to your database in whatever your environment is, Azure, your QA or production even environment.
Yep, absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave it just because I want to. And then I'm just going to hit next, and then I'll hit publish, and then I'll let this do its thing. Now, while it's doing its thing in the background, and I am going to let it publish out, I do want to highlight kind of one very important note here, and that is going back to our global ASAX, that on our global ASAX, you're going to notice that right here we had our set initializer, which is now going to drop and recreate the database every single time, which is probably not a good thing to put that inside of there. So what we can actually do is we can actually put that into our web.config file. So we could actually just globally, let's get down to the bottom, put that inside of Entity Framework, or if we just wanted that for debug, then we could just inside of debug, just simply say Entity Framework, without the caps lock on, Entity Framework, and then now inside of here, put in that call to that context. So now just on debug builds will it be dropping and recreating that database. Because obviously, after we push this out to production, we probably don't want to drop and recreate the database. Because again, Adam, that could wind up being an
resume generating event.
There
RGE.
you go, an RGE. So this is really a better way to go in and do that, is manage that through the config file. And so anyway, Let's come back over here. You'll notice that there's our little Azure website. Let me go into our artists. There we go, hit enter, and let's just make sure that this comes up. Chugga, 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 and poof, there is our little page. Let's go in, create a brand new artist, first artist, and let's hit create. And voila, there is our first artist. Let's go ahead and edit this, edited, and hit save, and voila, that has now been edited. So just like that, we can go off and hooray! Although that wasn't an explosion, that was actually good. My demo worked. Yay! That was fireworks. There we go. Although really, celebrating with explosions, I think, is a great idea. But really, the purpose of that last little demo is just to show how easy it was to take everything that we'd been working on all day and push that up to Azure. Cool. So with that, couple last little things. Number one, absolutely go off and start working with this. Number two is all of this code will be available on GitHub. I've been checking in my work during the day. I'll do one last check in a couple of moments. You can find us there at our respective Twitter handles. With that, I do want to thank you guys for tuning on in. Adam?
It's been a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Can we show this last slide I have up there?
Oh, yeah.
A couple additional resources there. There's one that's posted out on ASP.NET on implementing repository and unit of work patterns. A couple of folks have asked about that. There's another one on reducing code-first database chatter, so check that out as well. And Entity Framework 7 is open source, and you can find that on github.com/ASP.NET/Entity Framework.
There you go. And we'll throw all those links into the chat window. We'll be around for a few more minutes if anybody else has questions to answer them. And with that, hopefully we'll see you guys again. We do have a lot of great MVAs coming up on the mean stack, on web API design.
Very cool.
So yeah, if you're looking to do it, either Microsoft, open source, come on back to MVA. With that, cheers. Thanks a lot.
Fill out the survey?
Yes, do fill out that survey. Yes,
helps us
that
a
survey
lot.
down at the very bottom. Fill that out. All right.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.